Do you struggle to photograph birds in flight? In this video, I'll share some top tips on how to perfect this challenging technique. The video you're about to watch is actually one of 38 lectures in my best-selling online course called Wildlife Photography for Beginners and Amateurs that not only covers settings, but also equipment, light, composition, creativity, and animal behavior. So click on the link in the video description if you'd like to learn more and enroll. One thing I get asked very often by beginner wildlife photographers is how to photograph birds in flight. Now, before I get to the settings, I believe that it's very important that you actually give yourself a chance to see some birds flying. And the best way to do that is to go to places where you know you've got a chance. One such option is to take a boat ride and go to a place known as a heronry. That's basically where a whole lot of different water birds come together to roost for the night. If you go to a heronry late in the afternoon, you'll see birds soaring in from every direction, and you can easily photograph them hand-holding your camera. Some of the best and biggest heronries are found in Botswana's Okavango Delta, but you'll also find them in other marshy areas or along big rivers. Another great opportunity to photograph birds in flight is to go to their nesting sites, like we did for these Cape vultures that breed on the edge of a cliff. As long as you keep a safe distance, you can get some excellent opportunities of them gliding past you. And what makes vultures so nice to photograph is not only do they fly nice and slowly, but they often fly together. Another amazing nesting site where I have photographed birds in flight before lies in Namibia's Zambezi region, where thousands of carmine bee-eaters nest on the ground between August and November every year. Here you are allowed to get very close to the nesting sites, and whenever they fly up, it gives you an excellent opportunity of capturing these beautiful birds in flight. And because they're there for a few months every year and you can walk all around the nesting sites, you're guaranteed to have some excellent opportunities of photographing birds in flight. One of the best places to photograph birds in flight is at an underground hide, because you know they're going to take off the moment that they've finished drinking. Going to these places where you know you have a chance to see birds flying will really increase your chances of getting the perfect bird in flight shot, rather than just driving around on your own in a national park and hoping that you get an opportunity. If you do get an opportunity though, whether it's planned or by chance, it's very important to choose the right settings. And the first thing is to make sure that your shutter speed is fast enough. Switch to shutter priority where you choose the shutter speed value, and make sure that you choose auto ISO so that the images don't underexpose when you choose a very fast shutter speed in relatively low light conditions. If it's a big bird like this martial eagle taking off or this heron flying back to its nest, you only need a shutter speed of around 1,000th of a second to freeze the action. The smaller the bird, the faster they typically fly, which means you need a faster shutter speed to freeze the action. For the skimmer, it was a 2,000th of a second. And for tiny birds like these weavers, you obviously need your fastest shutter speed to freeze the action, which is usually a 4,000th or an 8,000th of a second, depending on the camera that you use. If you're photographing birds in flight in good light, you might as well choose your fastest shutter speed and shutter priority, irrespective of the size of the bird. The next setting that we've got to get right is our focus. If you're photographing a bird flying past you, like the vultures I told you about earlier, make sure that your autofocus mode is in continuous. In other words, AI servo for Canon users and AFC for Nikon users. That will allow the camera to lock onto the bird and track it as it moves past you. Also, don't use a single focus point on its head, but rather increase it to a small cluster, which will lock onto your subject a little bit easier than it would with a single focus point. The reason we can afford to choose more focus points is because there are no other objects in the scene that can potentially steal our focus. If, however, you're photographing a static bird that you're expecting to take off, use a single focus point on its eye and make sure that you lock the focus by choosing one shot if you're a Canon user and AFS if you're a Nikon user. In these cases, the birds typically take off too fast for us to track the focus, and we're basically hoping that it takes off within our depth of field. And that brings us to the next important setting, choosing your f-stop. If the birds that you are photographing are very close to you, like at an underground hide, and you have an extremely shallow depth of field, it's worthwhile to switch from shutter priority, where the camera will most likely choose the lowest f-stop, to manual mode, where you can still choose that fast shutter speed, but also increase your f-stop a little bit to give you a slightly greater depth of field. Auto ISO will make sure that the exposure comes out correctly. That just gives you a little bit bigger margin of error and a greater chance to get the bird in focus when it takes off. In these kind of situations though, you ideally want the bird to take off straight up and stay within your depth of field. And this can be very tricky to get right because they often launch themselves in the wrong direction. Getting a photograph like this where the bird not only takes off within our depth of field but faces us and has its wings wide open takes a lot of patience and persistence. The last setting that's very important to set correctly for birds in flight is your burst mode, and it's got to be in high continuous. In other words, you've got to photograph like a machine gun. That just means that you'll have more photographs in the sequence and thus a bigger chance for a very nice pose. It's all good and well using a fast shutter speed, the right focus mode and depth of field, as well as high continuous, but in order to get good birds in flight shots, you also have to compose them well. For birds that are already flying, I make sure to go in tight, and I basically use the normal rules of space to compose my photographs. Enough space behind, above and below it, and a little bit more space in the direction that it's flying. If however you're photographing a static bird that you're expecting to take off, you've got to consider its wingspan. Even if you think you've left enough space, you can easily cut off the wingtips of a large bird like this fish eagle when it takes off. The same happened with these mouse birds. I thought I left enough space at the top, but because they take off so quickly, I really struggled to get them in the frame once they took off. Rather zoom out a little bit and make sure you leave more than enough space around the bird. That way you just increase your chances of getting that perfect takeoff shot, even if it spreads its wings very wide like this roller. Am I leaving enough space for a takeoff shot of this fish eagle? No, I'm not. Its wingspan is just way too big. For big birds like this, I zoom out much more, giving me a much greater chance of that perfect shot. Let me share another few top tips with you for photographing birds in flight. The first thing is that most birds like taking off into the wind. So knowing which direction that's coming from will give you a better chance to position yourself and get that perfect shot. A lot of birds also stretch or defecate just before they take off. So if they've been sitting still for a very long time and then they do that, you better get ready. It's also good to learn a little bit about birds' behavior. Something like a red-billed quelea will often only drink once. In other words, if they come down to the water's edge, they'll take one gulp and fly away immediately. And that means you know exactly when to press the trigger. Certain birds like white-fronted bee-eaters also like sitting on a specific perch, flying up to catch an insect and then landing right back in the same position. And that means if you pre-focus on that branch, you've got a great opportunity getting a photograph when they come back in to land. I hope you are now better equipped to photograph birds in flight. Remember, you need a nice fast shutter speed to freeze the action. You also need the right focus mode, so you need to track the focus if they're flying, and you need to lock the focus if they're sitting still and you're expecting them to take off. You also need to choose the right depth of field. In other words, if you're very close, you might just have to increase a little bit, making sure that that bird takes off within your depth of field. Also make sure that you photograph on high continuous to make sure that you get the whole sequence of the takeoff. And lastly, make sure to leave enough space when you compose your photographs. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. And remember to check out that link in the video description if you'd like to enroll in my online course, Wildlife Photography for Beginners and Amateurs.